bit about myself. I'm a CRM engineer at Vaspian, which is in the States and New York State. I am 100% remote. I've been in Zoho for 12 years. My background is in software development. I started out working for a construction company, set them up on Zoho, set up some automation, started learning the software development process. Then eventually I moved over to working for two of the larger Zoho consultancies in the States. And then I transitioned to where I'm at now. Primarily now my time is spent doing Ruby and Ruby on Rails web development, integrating into the Zoho environment. I still do a lot of coding in Deluge and configurations in Zoho across CRM, desk, books, primarily some analytics, but a lot now that we've gotten to a good point in CRM. Now we're building integrations into it from our different platforms. And that's, like I said, primarily with Ruby on Rails, but we're also using PHP, JavaScript, Python. That's primarily what I work in. We do have some Java, I believe some Go. So we're using a lot of different languages, but I don't use the Java or Go. We're gonna go over just APIs in general, briefly. Then we're gonna go over Zoho's documentation on three of the key apps that I'm most familiar with, which is CRM, books, desk. It's going to be a fairly quick overview. I just kind of want to point out how I use it, and some key things that I'm using very frequently. And then we're going to do a little bit of interacting with the APIs in Deluge. I'm going to go over the use case that I have with my development process and how I use Deluge in CRM. And then I'm going to go over just an example of where I needed to do something outside of Zoho with the custom application. Okay, great. So let's start with the Zoho CRM API documentation. There's a couple versions, so keep that in mind if you're pulling this up. From my experience, there's not a lot of differences. What you'll notice in newer versions is there's more features, more that you can do with it. Maybe someone else has noticed that maybe they're not as backwards compatible. I haven't noticed that, but once I start using a newer version, then I change everything to that version, and I don't really look back. There is one exception, which I'll go over. All right. I did jump ahead just a little bit here. So APIs in general, and actually this is a good page to go over it. There's going to be two main protocols for doing API calls. You're going to either interact with a REST, probably the majority of your time, or you may use an older one called SOAP. I have a use case where I have to work with a SOAP. REST APIs are fairly consistent across the board, where you're going to be doing authenticating, and then you're going to be doing you're either going to be retrieving data with the GET, you're going to be doing a POST where you're updating data. And I'll show an example here. So this would be a GET. So you're getting data, and in the CRM world, that might be getting a lead, getting an account, etc. You're making a POST where you're going to be putting new data into the application. You're going to be doing a put. And in CRM, that's updating existing data, and then you're going to be doing a delete. I don't do too many deletes. I could see delete being useful from an API perspective if maybe you're trying to remove old data via the API. I can find a good use case for that. I generally, as a rule of thumb, try not to delete data. If somebody's manually creating data and they accidentally create a duplicate, I usually just tell them to delete it rather than try to do it via the API. To me, that's just fraught with a problem to delete things. And I like to persist data whenever possible. The other thing is you're gonna let's see here. Let's see if I'm getting ahead of myself here. So I mentioned authenticating, I mentioned the methods, and then you're going to be getting a response. And generally that's going to be in the form of JSON. And if you're familiar with the maps in Deluge, JSON looks very similar to when you info your maps, or if you have a list inside of a map. JSON looks very similar. And if you're making your integration tasks or even doing an invoke URL in Deluge, then you've interacted with the JSON. So those are kind of the key components of working with any API, but specifically the Zoho ones. All right. Now, for all of the Zoho apps, you're gonna be doing an authentication. If you are doing it in Deluge, you have the option to skip the authentication process and set up a connection. And I'm going to go over the pros and cons of that. And then the other option is you can actually set up authentication. And so with the OAuth authentication, what you do is you go to the console.zoho APIs. Here, there's a link, takes you to the Zoho Developer Console. I'm not going to go there because my client ID will show in the URL. And I recommend if you ever make a YouTube video, don't go here and do that because you don't want to expose that. But you would go there, and then it would give you the option to set up. In most cases, you're probably going to be setting up a self-client because maybe you're building a simple app, or you're just using Deluge, or maybe a serverless function on AWS or on Catalyst or Google Cloud. And so really you're doing what it states here is server to server interaction. If you're doing it on the front end, maybe you're making some API calls on a front end of an application using some JavaScript. They have that there, or even mobile applications. I'm not going to speak to that because I don't have experience with that. My experience is with the self-client. But I don't want to delve too deep into the OAuth authentication, but it boils down to you go into the developer console. You're going to put in the scope for starters, and it shows it right. Once they go down a little bit further, let's see right here, I believe. And this shows an example of what scope you're looking for. I'm not seeing the screenshot of actually inserting it in, but you're going to insert the scope that you're looking for. So I'm going to show you where you'll realize what you need for scope. And that's basically your permissions to access stuff via the API. So if you're getting records, this API call shows you what scope you need. So generally speaking, I like to just add the scope of modules all. That way I can interface with all of the modules. I can read, I can write, update, etc. So that's what I generally like to do. You probably will also add the search capability. So if you're searching for records, there's a specific access you need here, Zoho search.securesearch.read. And so that's if you're running a query using the search API. There's another common one, trying to get to the, there we go, the query API. The other common one that I use and that I've heard that people use is the COQL. So this has got its own permissions or scope needed. So you would add all of these in, add one, do a comma, add the other one, and then from there it's going to give you like the equivalent of an OTP. So if you're doing two-factor, it's giving you the equivalent of a temporary code. And then you're going to use, I use Postman. So I would go into Postman. I already have this set up, and I would put this code in, and then it gives me back an access token, refresh token, and an access token. The refresh token is like the password for that app. And then the access token is like your temporary. So you get like really 4 things that you need to pass to get access. You use the client secret, the client ID, and the refresh token to make an authentication, and then it comes back with an access token. And then you see right here in the header, that's what you're putting in as your header. And it's really one password once you've authenticated, right? Zoho says, yep, you're good to go. Now you pass that in and make your API call in your header. And I'm gonna show how that works in Deluge in a little bit. One thing that I like to do is I like to have a refresh token for every application and for every API that application is accessing. So let's say I have an application that is interfacing with CRM and books. So then I have a refresh token for CRM, and then I have a refresh token for books. And then in CRM, I just have a refresh token for CRM. A couple of things to be aware of in the CRM. Let's scroll down here. Let's go back to the records. I want to do a post. So when you're sending data to the CRM, it's got to be in a map if you're in Deluge or a hash or object and other languages, but it's got to be a key of data. And then you're going to pass an array or a list with each following hash or map with the data that you're sending over. Then the other thing to note is be sure that you know exactly the data type that you're writing to. You're going to run into some fun errors if you're trying to write a decimal to a number, or if you're writing to a date and you don't have it formatted properly. Generally, for like say a date field, it's going to be your full year 2024 dash the month with the leading 0, so 03 dash 19, or 01 if it's the first. So it's got to be the full thing. You got to have your leading zeros if it's a single digit day or month, or you're going to get back an error message. Date time, I'm not going to get into that. That's a little more complex, but that has to be precise as well. You're gonna get a response back saying that your JSON's not well formatted, or something along those lines. Also, be sure if you get an error message, if you're making a call to get or update a record, and everything looks fine, and say you're passing a variable for the let's go to the put. So let's say the record ID, you're passing it as a variable. Just make sure you're not doing for a different module, because the error message you'll get back is just invalid URL. So let's say you're on an account and your function is pulling data from the account and you're going to update the deal. And let's say you accidentally put the account ID in for the deal ID. It's just going to give you a response saying that your URL is invalid. And that could be a little confusing at times because you might say, well, no, it's correct. I'm putting a string for the ID. My URL is fine. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you get that error message, you may have inadvertently put another module's ID in there. That'll happen to me from time to time. Right. Let's see here. Let's move on to some of the limitations that you're going to run into here. It's a rolling 24 hours as far as Zoho CRM tailing your usage. So let's say you've got a big scheduled function to clean up or sync some data, and maybe you're using 5,000 credits at midnight. And then throughout the day, you're using maybe another 10,000. So you're probably going to sit at, what did I say, maybe 5 and then 10 throughout the day. So you're going to be sitting at roughly 15,000 consistently, because when midnight hits, yesterday's 5,000 will drop off, but then you're going to make another call to add another 5,000. So you're going to drop down and then immediately drop back up, go back up. So keep in mind that it's rolling. So if you are running a bulk function manually to maybe do some data cleanup and you got some other stuff running, maybe that stuff isn't running every day. Maybe it's running every other day or once a week. Keep that in mind as you do maybe a major bulk read or update, so that you don't inadvertently go over, say in the middle of the night or something and cause a hiccup. And the tally here is based on, this base and then the number of users. You can purchase more credits too. Haven't done that for a while, so I think there's a spot in the CRM where you can do that if need be. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a while since I've had to do that. Other thing to keep in mind is the actual usage per call. Some of them are more, some are less. I've generally not had to do more than getting or updating records or using this COQL. I do a few converts. I generally do my insert, update, or upserts in groups of 100. So my credits are actually lower. So instead of being one API call for every 100 records, it's just 10 API calls, which I'm gonna go over that shortly. Yeah, and there's more on here for other things, but those are the internal connections between Zoho applications. It's actually going to be for the CRM in general. So if you have internal connections, such as an integration task, zoho.crm.update record, that however many times that particular one runs or any of the other ones in your code run, that's going to add to it. And then your external applications will also add to the calls. So any API call and those integration tasks count as the API call, because all it is just a wrapper over the API, so you don't have to make the direct API call. The Deluge is handling the API call for you, but it's still an API call. Okay, then the other thing, this is a little more advanced, but I thought it was worth mentioning for those of you. I saw we have some on the call who've done some custom application development outside of Zoho. Yeah. You can do concurrency, so you can have multiple API calls happening at the same time. You're going to probably at various times in CRM have a couple calls going at the same time. So when you're developing an application outside of the CRM, keep that in mind. You don't want to go right up to the limit. If you're writing asynchronous code and you're saying, okay, I need to do a bulk write, and I want to hit the API roughly 10 times at the same second, if your limit is, if you're on the 10 limit, you may run into a problem because there may be some Deluge code that's also hitting the API at the same time. So you just got to, give yourself some buffer if you're doing asynchronous code, because you don't want to hit the limit and get an error message. But this is really great if say you're on a pay-for-play platform, such as the serverless code on Catalyst or some of the other platforms. If you have a lot of usage on there, it's based on your memory and your CPU usage. So if you can make concurrent calls at the same time, it's going to keep your CPU usage just a little lower, your runtime lower, which is another key component. So that's great. That's great. It's also nice too for code just to run quickly. I always get nervous if I have something going on for a couple minutes. I'd rather it go quickly and fail, especially during testing. So it was great just to run it, and 5 seconds later I get a fail versus waiting, 3 or 4 minutes and getting a fail, which if it's going that long, you're really running into an issue if you're just doing it in Deluge, because there's a timeout limit of 5 minutes. So that's where concurrency can be really helpful outside of CRM. All right, I think that covers that. Let's go to Zoho Books. There's a lot of similarities in Zoho Books. You're going to be passing an OAuth token. You're going to need to get, you're going to need to set scope at that developer console for Books, as well as for Desk and any other application. And then you're going to have to get the token for that. A couple things that are different here than in CRM. So in this example, if you're grabbing the organization ID, or even if you're grabbing an invoice, the way the response is it comes back with organizations or just organization or just invoice. So it's a little different on that end. Quick sample I wanted to show here. So if you have something running from CRM or outside of the Zoho environment, let's say you have an event take place in CRM. Maybe a deal is won, and you need to invoice a client, or maybe you have a module in there that's triggers like somebody's usage. Maybe it's an install or something, and you want to trigger creating an invoice. One of the first things that you need in order to create that invoice is the Zoho Books customer ID. So what you actually have to do is you're going to have to look for that contact. You're going to have to list out the contacts, and one of your parameters in your API call is going to have to be the Zoho account ID. Yeah, so first thing, if you're creating an invoice outside of Books, is you got to get the account ID. And if you're doing it from CRM, then you're going to grab the account ID and you're going to pass that as a parameter into the Books API so that you can get the what they call a contact. And then going back over here to the invoice, and you can pass the that ID and it'll assign the invoice to them. And if you don't pass it, then you're going to get an error message. One other thing I wanted to note on here specifically, generally speaking, I'm going to guess that most people are paying online nowadays, but whether it's via PayPal, Authorize.net, or some of the other, Stripe is a big one. And it helps to actually configure that when you're generating the invoice. And so you're going to have to pass this this object with an array with an object for the gateway. And then you'll have to specify what the name of the gateway is, and it gives you the names. And then you want to make sure you're configured as yes. So if we go back up here, should be towards the bottom here. So you see here, they're passing the payment options. And then that's helpful, especially if you're generating a large amount of invoices, which if you're using the API, you're probably generating a lot of invoices. You want to make sure this is configured so that you don't have to go in and check it off. And then they get it, they click the Pay Now button, or if you've enabled them in the portal, they can log in and pay it. Let's see. The other thing you can do here is you can pass the query parameter for send. I haven't used it. Usually I create the invoice and then I make another API call to send it. But both will work. If you know this invoice is ready to go when you create it, probably good just to send it right out. That way the accounting team doesn't have to comb through a bunch of invoices and validate them. If everybody knows the invoice is good, then there's no reason not to just send it out as soon as it's created. Of course, every organization is going to differ in how they want to handle that. But if that's feasible, that's the route I would go. Other thing here is it does give you samples of different languages. If you haven't seen this before, this could be really helpful just to know how you might make that API call into here and how to format the data that you're passing, the parameters, etc. Let's move on to Zoho Desk. All right. The only thing I wanted to point out here, because everything is very similar across the apps. You're going to pass the authentication. You're going to get an authentication for the specific application. You're going to have to set the scope and whatnot. But what I wanted to point out that's unique here, especially if you don't have too much experience with Desk, is the difference between tickets and threads from the API's perspective. If you want to auto send a reply or what have you, then you need to know, was it the client that replied or was it someone on your end who sent a response over? And you'll need to get the ticket, and then you're going to need to get the threads for that ticket. If you already have the ticket ID, then you just need to get the threads. But just getting the ticket, you don't get the conversation. So there's just something to keep in mind if you haven't had too much interaction in there. The conversation is different from the ticket. I mean, it's not obvious unless you've run into that. Like you might scratch your head and try to figure out why am I not getting the conversation when I'm retrieving the ticket? Because what you get is the description, and the description it may be if someone on your side created the ticket. What you need is the threads. Then of course you can get the rest of the data in there, but those were two of the main things that I wanted to point out. Or the main thing really is that you don't get the threads when you're grabbing a ticket from Zoho Desk, and that was one of the biggest hurdles that I face interacting with the API. Other than that, the API is very deep. You can see all of the different things that you can do here. It's a little mind-blowing to think about all of the options here on the Zoho Desk side. You can basically reconfigure everything in Zoho Desk just from the API. It's just it's really great. One use case that I was exploring internally was just being able to have manager access to remove somebody's availability. So if somebody is away from their desk, Zoho Desk has this available or not available feature. And when you do round robin, you can have it set to assign those tickets based on who's logged in and available. And so you could grab the agent and then provide some sort of UI to say, no, this person's actually no longer available. So that was a use case that we were exploring for a while, and that would have involved a lot of work with the API. So that covers that. Let's move on over to Deluge and CRM. So I mentioned that I don't use connections. If I said it otherwise, I don't use connections in CRM. If I'm making an API call inside a CRM to CRM, I don't use a connection. And the reason why is I use the sandbox very heavily. We have a lot of processes that are running throughout the day. And if I need to make a modification on the fly, I couldn't inadvertently break something that's mission critical. And then our team is stuck, they're not able to do what they need to. And so I decided to move the development into the sandbox. One of the hurdles I ran into when doing that is when I use a connection in in the sandbox. That connection does not carry over to production. And you can't use a variable. So if I, let me explain that. So if I add connection here, I can't say like connection name and then save the connection as a variable somewhere. It actually has to be a string. So that means that when I move the code to production, I have to open up the function or functions if I'm pushing multiple functions, and I have to change all the connections. And I had too many instances where I got 3 out of 4 or 5 out of 6 and things weren't working. And I knew I needed a different solution because it had just happened too many times, despite my best efforts to be as thorough as possible. There's just the human element in there where I'll miss them. So I needed to work around. So what I did was I created a refresh token for the sandbox, and I saved that as a CRM variable. And then I have every 30 minutes, I'm making a call to get a new token. And I did 30 minutes because I don't want to have any potential overlap, because your token is good for 60 minutes. So if I at 1 p.m., I grab the token, and then I want to grab it again at 1:30, because if it does it at 1 and 30 seconds, and I only do it every hour, and it does it at 2 and 40 seconds, I have a 10-second gap where my token is invalid. So I do it every 30 minutes, so that way the token is never invalid. And then when I'm running a function here, I grab that and I set the header. So when I make an API call, I'm using that token. And going to the off schedule, I mentioned that I set it as CRM variables. CRM variables are great, by the way. If you're not using those are great, especially if you're working in sandbox and production. You're going to have a different token for a different refresh token in both environments. The other thing you're also going to have different is, if you look at my URL here, and I'll just put this in, let me make this a little bigger. So I have a big monitor. So you see the subdomain is CRM Sandbox. So let's say I have a button on an account to create a deal. When I hit that button, I want to navigate to the deal, right? Well, if I just do www, it's not going to navigate to it because that's not the subdomain for Sandbox. So I actually have the subdomain saved as a variable. So if I do need to redirect somebody there, it'll redirect no problem. And then in production, they have www. The other thing is you have your CRM org ID. That'll be like, I think you can set that. But when I created the sandbox this morning, this was the org ID I got. So I set that in the CRM variables again, so that I can navigate to where I need to. The other CRM variable that's important to keep in mind is the subdomain for your functions. I've noticed, and maybe others have noticed, that if I am in the sandbox and I make an API call and it's www.zoho APIs, generally I don't have a problem. But I'd rather just stick with, the Zoho's documentation recommends that you do sandbox, which would be the subdomain for the API. So that's what I've done. That way, if it becomes the development team at Zoho decides, okay, we're gonna make this a requirement now. I'm not out of water. I'm good to go. I don't have to go in and change everything. That covers that. That's really important, right? You want to make sure that when you're developing, you're not cornering yourself later on if things change. You're just ready to go and make the necessary changes. So let's say maybe in 5 years, it might be some new subdomain that the development team decides is just going to be best practice. Well, you can just change it here and you're good to go. Versus opening up maybe 2 10 to 50 functions and combing through and finding out, where it is and changing it. So you're ready to go for any change that might come up. All right. And then that goes over here to, that's similar as well. Let me rephrase that. I mentioned why I don't use connections, and it's actually relevant as well for when you're making an integration call. So if I do, let's see, Zoho.CRM.getRecordByID, I can get the accounts and I can pass, set ID. So let's say a variable name. That'll work fine. Zoho's documentation, when I was double checking it this morning, recommended that you should have a connection name in there. And they had a chat with support, and they said when I talked with them, they said at this time we're not requiring. So I'm guessing at some point it will be required. So keep that in mind when you're using the connections, because if you're using Sandbox, then you're going to have to change it in your integration tests. So again, this kind of is the same with me having the token instead of the connection. It's a little harder to change that when you're using the integration test than if you're just passing it as a header data in an invoke URL. So again, with all of the things I just described, I'm just trying to make sure that this is easy to maintain later on down the road, and that I'm not building up a bunch of technical debt that causes the application, the CRM environment, to be a bear to manage. So that's why I have this there. And I use these almost exclusively rather than the integration tests for that reason. One of the things we went over was the data key. So if you're uploading data, so let's do an example here. So this is a button, or you would create a deal off of the account. So I would create like a deal map equals. Let's just keep it simple. I'm not going to do fun coding. Deal map dot put deal name, and then we'll just call it something. And then when I'm going to pass that and create that, what I have to do is I have to create another map and list. Deal list equals list. Going data map equals map. I'm going to add the deal map to the deal list. And then for the data map, I'm going to add the deal list. And then I'll add some parameters, which would be the data map. I like to always just do to string. Sometimes if I don't do it, it works. But I'd rather just stay consistent and always have it. And then this is going to be a post. I have a couple other required fields. So I'm going to add those. Deal. I mentioned our company is in, actually I didn't mention we're a telecom company. So one of our pipelines is a phone. You can get a phone system installed, and that should cover it. All right. And then if I run this, we would get a response back. Let's see, info. Now we'll do an info count response. Let's see here. So let's go to get an account. I have one account in here. It's Zoho. Had this on full screen, so I wasn't seeing the tabs on my end. All right, so now we're good. First off, I'm not gonna do that. First, let's look at the response that we get from the account. I have an invalid auth token. Let me refresh the auth token. I have a feeling that may happen. Because this was a sandbox environment that I spun up this morning. I had anticipated that I might run into that. Okay, so now it should run. There we go. So I got the data back. And just like when you're sending the data over, when you receive it, you get the data back. So that's helpful. If you need to figure out what the names of the different fields are, this is always helpful. Now that that's successful, this is also successful. We haven't had any problems there. Actually, we did have a problem. Let's not dig too far into that, because I know I want to make sure we have time for Q&A at the end. The first part of this was working. We may have had a problem with getting the data back and trying to parse it out here. One of the things I wanted to point out at the bottom here was another great feature with interacting with Zoho's APIs, and that's this concept of standalone functions. So you see down here, I'm doing standalone.test suite. So I had on a previous developers hangout, I had gone through some different ways that you can do exception handling and testing in the CRM. And so I actually created a function that'll receive some different data from a function, and then it'll see if everything's working, and then it'll email me a notification, tell me what may have gone wrong, which can be really helpful because if you have a successful API call here, success on Zoho's end means that you got a response back, whether that response is an error message or a 200 response where the record was received or created or what have you. It's successful in Deluge's parsing and their compiler. So you don't get an error message, but if you don't get data back, you want to know that. So that's where you'll see in my code here, I'm trying to figure out, did I get a response back and was the size greater than 0? And if not, then my test suite parses through that and says, oh, you didn't get a response back. So that's helpful for me because then I can kind of stay ahead of the curve and go in and dive into it right away rather than the users running into this and then maybe they don't tell me right away and then a couple of days go by and then it turns into a big deal because a lot of data didn't get created or updated or what have you. So that's why I have this here. But the point is these standalone functions. The nice thing about these is you can also make these an API endpoint. So if I close out of this, I have one here. Let's just do a test function. And just want to show what that function actually. Let's just work with what I have here. Let's do this one. I'm going to make it a REST API. And then this here gives you the URL for this. So I mentioned earlier that there was one exception to me using version 5 on the APIs, and that's when I'm making a function call via the API. It's a version 2. You'll see it right here. It's V2, right in the center where my cursor is. So you'll copy that if you're making an API call, whether in Zoho or in CRM or outside of CRM. And you'll have to do the authentication and whatnot. But then you can do that and you can pass some parameters. So if I actually go back to the one I mentioned, I have my arguments called CRM API request. When I looked through the documentation, it was leading me to put that in there as the argument. And then if I go back to the other one that I'm working on here, you see that this is what I'm passing as that, right? I'm passing a map with the key as params, and then I add whatever I need to as follow-up keys in there. So it's a map of a map. The value is another map. And then you'll receive that here, and you'll do get JSON, and you'll get your params, and then you can just grab all the variables from there and use them. Use them however you need. Because writing Deluge, if you're not using that, then you may have some code that you're reusing in different functions, and you're going to have to maintain it in different functions. And so if you can pull it out of there and have it as a standalone function, then you can reuse it wherever you need to. And if it's not working, you just modify that one function rather than in 5 different places where maybe it is. So that's really useful. And it's also helpful because if you're used to programming, for those of you who've programmed in like JavaScript, and I saw PHP on there, and some of the other languages, Python, you're used to that, right? You have a function, and maybe inside of that function, you're calling another function, or at the bottom of your JavaScript file, you're calling another function. And so that's where Deluge allows you to have that ability. Okay, great. So last thing I wanted to go over was a use case where I decided that I needed to do interface with the APIs outside of the Zoho environment. So we have a product where we provide clients a platform where they can send an SMS to their clients. And we like to pull the usage from that into CRM and then bill them based on their usage. So we grab usage daily, create data in CRM, and then we invoice them. And so for a variety of reasons, we decided to do this outside of Zoho. We're doing it in Zoho, and we were just, this is one use case where it just wasn't the right tool for the job. So what we're using is a Ruby on Rails. It's giving us more control. I'm going to be creating queues in there. If an API call fails, then the job that is doing the processes will stay in the queue, and it'll try and run again. And then I also can create some classes. So it's like a template of an object. So if I am interfacing with the CRM API, I have a template for that. And we're going to be building other integrations in this app. So I only had to write the template to interact, or the class, with CRM one time. And then I'll be able to use it for all sorts of use cases, from pulling from other platforms that we have, doing some complex operations that we need to. Another thing that, if I dive in here, let me refresh this. Okay. So this is on GitHub. This is the process that's running. So you see here, I'm providing some logs to a log file. that things got initiated. There's a lot of them in here. I thought I had deployed to not show this because there's a lot, but this is helpful from a logging perspective to see where in the process it's not working. And this will be run on a schedule, and so I can get those details to find out where in the process it's working fine, where it's not, and even run queries off of all of the executions and query what may or may not be working consistently. The other thing is I mentioned the timeout limit. So in Deluge, you're going to hit a 5-minute limit. Here, I don't have a limit. I can have this execution run as long as I need. And I mentioned I can make it repeatable. And the other thing I'm doing here is I'm doing things concurrently. So when I am later on, when I'm pushing all of these requests to the API, I'm actually doing 10 calls at the same time. And then when the first one is done, another one triggers. So I always have 10 in process at the same time versus in like, if I'm not doing it concurrently or asynchronously here, then the first one will run. And when that's done, the second one will run. So that's a really great thing that I'm able to do. JavaScript, you can do that as well. So it's really great to do that. And also, let's see here. The other thing is I'm able to process, I go to here. So I mentioned that you're going to make your API calls for a post and a put in groups of 100 or less if you have less records. So I was able to create a method to do that. So it checks how many records do I have, and then I divide it by 100 so I can figure out how many times am I hitting the API call in groups of 100. So if it's like 150, I'm going to hit it 2 times. First time I'm going to do 100. Second time I'm going to do 50. And in that second call, I need to find out what's the end index, because I'm passing like a list or an array in here. And if it's 150, the first time I grab index 0 to 99, right? Well, the next time I need to know that I need to grab 99 to whatever the end index is. And then I'm making a call to Zoho, and I'm doing it in groups of I believe 10 or 5. Actually, I'm doing 5 here. I had to lower my threshold here because we have a lot going on, and I don't want to hit a problem. So I'm making 5 calls at a time, and when the first one's done, we trigger another one. So there's always 5 running until the data is all added. So it's great use case for this, and also just to make it. I can use this for any other integration we need to do, or if we need to do a complex process into the CRM, I have all the methods already created to make the API calls to Zoho. There's a use case to be said for using the SDKs, whether it's Ruby or Python or JavaScript or whatever. But I wasn't doing anything. At this point, I didn't have a lot of needs, so I just needed a few methods to make a post, make a put, or just generic API call. When I say generic API call, when I make a call, I need to know, was it successful or not? So that is its own function. And I pass whether it's a get or a post or a put in there. And let me show that. So that was another great thing I was able to do here. So you see here, I have a method or a function that's just an API call, and I pass what type it is. And then from there, I hit the Zoho API based on whether it's a get, a post, or a put. And then I validate the response. And this is going to be consistent regardless of what type of API call I'm making. And so then when I'm doing, say, a put, then inside of that other method I showed you, I hit this method. So I'm breaking up the data into 100 records at a time. and then I make the API call here. So this worked out, where it's been working out really good for us. And I think that will cover everything. So, we went over just APIs in general, Zoho's documentation from a high level, and how to navigate it and what some of that means, how you might make your API calls in CRM, and then just a use case here where I found it beneficial to develop outside of Deluge. So open it up for any questions. Just takeaways here, like I was mentioning, some key things that I think will be helpful for you is have a refresh token for each application and each application Zoho app that it's accessing. So I wouldn't recommend that if you have an outside app that you have a refresh token for all of the Zoho apps. I would recommend that you have a refresh token only for CRM, only for books, only for desk projects, etc. That's more secure, because if you have one token that's accessing everything, and for whatever reason that token gets exposed to some bad actor, all of your apps are exposed, all of your data. So try to keep it to one if possible. And you have more control over the data when you're interfacing with the API versus the integration task. It's more scalable is what I showed. But the other thing I didn't mention was you get more data, generally speaking, when you hit the API versus when you do an integration task. Connections may become required, like I mentioned. So just have yourself ready in case it becomes a requirement in your integration tasks. But tokens are going to be your ticket if you're doing sandbox environment. Format your data correctly for the API. Take advantage of concurrency and use the right tool for the job. Deluge is the right tool for a lot of jobs. And then when it's not the right tool, you can develop a custom application.